Most people don't lose their integrity all at once. They lose it at threshold, in an argument, in a moment of urgency, in a room where everyone else is saying yes. Pressure doesn't destroy character, it reveals what governs it. I'm Kay McLeod, and this is Integrity Under Pressure, a podcast about self governance, consequence literacy, and how to protect your integrity when willpower isn't enough. Because integrity isn't a personality trait, it's a governance skill. There's a moment that appears in almost every human decision. Most people don't notice it because when it arrives, it feels urgent, it feels important, it feels like action is required immediately. And that feeling convinces people they are thinking clearly, but often they aren't. What they're actually experiencing is pressure deciding for them. Pressure has a very specific effect on the mind. It compresses time, it narrows perception, and it reduces the range of options the brain is able to consider. In other words, pressure doesn't just make decisions harder, it makes bad decisions feel obvious. You see this pattern everywhere. Someone is told, "This offer expires tonight. Only 3 spots left. If you don't act now, you'll miss the opportunity." Suddenly, the mind starts racing. What if I miss it? What if this is the one thing that changes everything? What if everyone else gets ahead while I hesitate? Urgency makes hesitation feel dangerous. And once hesitation feels dangerous, discernment begins to collapse. Now, the decision is no longer being made from clarity, it's being made from contraction. And contraction has a very simple message: do something now. There is a reason urgency works so well in marketing. It hijacks the same threat systems the brain uses to respond to danger. When the nervous system perceives a threat, whether it's a physical danger or social loss, the brain shifts into survival mode. The amygdala becomes more active. Attention narrows, time feels compressed, and long-term evaluation becomes much harder. In simple terms, your brain is trying to act fast, not think deeply, which is useful if you're escaping a burning building, but not particularly helpful when deciding whether to spend $2,000 on a course. And yet, this is exactly the moment many people make that decision. I know this because I've done it more than once. There was a period of my life when I was convinced that somewhere out there was a program that would unlock everything: the course, the method, the framework, the system that would finally explain what I was missing. And the marketing always sounded extremely convincing. This is a program that changes everything. And this is the framework successful people use. And enrollment closing tonight. And if you've ever heard those words, you know exactly what happens next. You start imagining the future version of yourself, the organized version, the successful version, the version who finally figured things out. And before long, you're reaching for your credit card. I did this many times. I swipe another course, another program, another promise that this one would be different. At one point, my Google Drive looked like a digital museum of unfinished transformations. Folders everywhere, programs, workbooks, training portals, entire systems I barely opened. And if someone had asked me why I kept buying them, I would have given a very reasonable answer: I'm investing in myself, which sounded admirable until I realized something uncomfortable. I wasn't investing, I was reacting. Reacting to urgency, reacting to pressure, reacting to the fear of missing out. And the strange thing about urgency is that it disguises itself as opportunity. The message always sounds positive. Don't miss this. Your future depends on this. Act now. But if you slow down and look closely, the emotional engine behind the message is often fear. Fear of missing out, fear of being left behind, fear that if you don't act immediately, the door will close forever. And fear is so very persuasive. Psychologists sometimes refer to this as scarcity bias. When people believe something is scarce or disappearing, its perceived value immediately increases. Experiments have shown that the same product appears for desirable simply when it is presented as limited. Nothing about the product changed, only the perception of time and availability, which tells us something important. Urgency doesn't just accelerate decisions, it distorts them. Now, this doesn't only happen in marketing, it happens in everyday life. Someone sends an emotional text and demands an answer immediately. A boss asks for a decision during a stressful meeting. A partner insists the conversation must happen right now. Or a parent feels pressure to respond instantly to a child's behavior. In each of these moments, the nervous system experiences the same signal. This needs to be solved immediately, right now. And when the mind believes something must be solved immediately, discernment begins to shrink. Options disappear, perspective narrows, the brain becomes less interested in asking good questions and more interested in ending the tension, which is why people often make decisions under pressure that they later regret. Not because they are incapable of thinking clearly, but because the conditions for clear thinking were temporarily removed. Pressure had taken the wheel. And there is a quote often attributed to Viktor Frankl that captures something essential about this moment. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. That space is where freedom lives. But urgency has a way of collapsing that space. The message becomes there is no time, decide now, act immediately. And when the space disappears, reaction replaces choice. Now, here's the part most people don't notice. Urgency is rarely about the actual decision, it's about the emotional discomfort of uncertainty. The brain dislikes unresolved tension. So when something feels urgent, the mind starts searching for the fastest way to restore calm. Sometimes that means making a decision that feels relieving in the moment but expensive later. Buying the course, agreeing to a commitment, saying yes when the wiser answer might have been, give me a day to think about it. But those words require something most people struggle with: tolerance for tension. Because discernment takes time. Discernment asks questions. Discernment waits for the emotional surge to settle. And waiting can feel incredibly uncomfortable when everything around you is saying, act now. Which brings us back to pressure. Pressure collapses discernment. It narrows perception, it compresses time, and when those three things happen together, the brain begins searching for the fastest exit from discomfort, which means the decision is no longer being made by your values. It is being made by your nervous system. And nervous systems under threat do one thing extremely well: they choose relief over wisdom. Now, this doesn't mean urgency is always manipulative. Sometimes life genuinely requires quick decisions. Emergencies happen, opportunities appear, deadlines exist. But the question worth asking is simple: who is actually making the decision? Is it you, or is it the pressure surrounding the moment? Because the difference between reaction and governance often comes down to one small thing: the ability to pause. Not forever, just long enough for the nervous system to settle, long enough for the mind to widen again, long enough to see more than one option. And that pause is where discernment returns. Discernment asks different questions. What happens if I wait? What changes tomorrow? What would this decision look like without emergency? Would I still choose this if there were no countdown timer? Those questions reopen the space urgency tried to close. And inside that space, something important becomes possible again: choice, real choice. Not the kind made under pressure, the kind made under governance. Today, I still buy courses. I still learn from teachers. I still invest in tools to help me grow. But something fundamental has changed. Urgency no longer decides for me because urgency is a signal, not an authority. When something feels extremely urgent now, I slow down. Not because the opportunity isn't valuable, but because clarity rarely arrives in a state of contraction. Clarity arrives when the nervous system settles, when perception widens, when time expands again. That is when discernment returns. And discernment is the foundation of self governance, which means the real question underneath every urgent discussion is simple: is this coming from clarity or from contraction? Because the two can feel very similar in the moment, but they produce very different lives. And the moment you learn to recognize the difference, pressure stops deciding for you. You start deciding for yourself. And that is where integrity under pressure actually begins. If this episode did anything, let it be this: you saw the pattern. Pressure is not the problem. The question is whether you govern yourself inside it. Hold that and decide what you're no longer willing to do on autopilot. Because integrity isn't a personality trait, it's a governance skill. I'll see you on the next episode.